Andy Austin here with another commentary on a chapter from The Rainbow Machine, Tales from a Neurolinguist Journal. I'll see if I can hold that correctly. Okay, now this chapter is about self-esteem. And the story that I give in the self-esteem chapter is one of those ones that when I've told it at workshops, initially people who are unfamiliar with me and my work are a little bit shocked by, because I basically in that session with the client, I did everything I shouldn't have done according to the rule book, and spoke to the client in a way that basically would be deemed to be unprofessional. And yet the reality of the way that I worked with that person, he found for the first time a therapist who actually understood how bad things are. It's a problem of therapists. They don't like to address the obvious elephant in the room when there is a person sat in front of them with a presentation issue. Like they might have really bad body odor. They might have a ridiculous haircut. Or some other personal issue that everyone ignores and doesn't draw attention to. They might have a terrible dress sense. They might have a really strange way of talking and be really annoying with their voice. They might have stuff going on that might actually account for a whole load of the problems they've got, but no one addresses it. I worked for a large manufacturing company a number of years ago. I worked in their on-site medical centre, so it's a very large manufacturing site. And they had a full-time online medical centre to deal with the age-related issues of their ageing workforce and also all the occupational health issues and accidents and stuff like that. And it was always interesting to me what would come over to medical, as everyone called it. Go over to medical. One day I took a phone call from a line manager who says, "Yeah, I'm sending a geezer over to you. He's got a bit of a problem with his breath. No one wants to work with him." And then he put the phone down. And I thought, why are you sending him to me? What's going on here? And this guy comes over. He has no idea why he's been sent to medical. And I basically said, you've been sent over here because your manager is too afraid to tell you you've got bad breath. And it's been mentioned and I've been told to tell you. And he went, "Oh," and walked back out again. One of the issues is people don't say these things to people. They don't say the most obvious stuff. And therapists are no differences. They will skirt around the actual issue in front of the person. If people have very poor presentation of self, then those things need to be addressed. And possibly when those things are addressed, that brings about a whole load of personal insight. And sometimes little changes we can make can bring about huge changes further down the line as incrementally things start to improve. And a lot of people who have self-esteem issues, who hate themselves, they might actually have, I know this might be amazing to some people, they might have good reason to hate themselves. They might actually be an awful human being. And I know we've got this lovely, new age, nicely, everyone's a valuable human being, everyone's worthy. Everyone's a good person. We just need to change the way we feel about ourselves. We just need to, when we align ourselves with being lovely on the inside, everything will be fine. That's not necessarily true. A lot of people are trapped in being someone they don't want to be, and they're trapped in sets of behaviours they don't know how to get rid of. But an awful lot of people are trapped in being a person they don't want to be. And this is not an uncommon problem. It's like, I'm in the wrong body, I'm in the wrong identity. Why do I behave in these ways? You'll know there's evidence for this because you'll beat yourself up on a regular basis. You'll hate on yourself. You'll call yourself names. You'll do all sorts of things in your head to give yourself a hard time because your presentation of self in the world isn't aligned with how you want it to be. And therapists might well build you up and tell you you're a worthy person, and maybe you're not worthy. Maybe you've never done anything noteworthy in your entire life. Fundamentally, I know people who are absolutely useless. They consume, they expect to be provided for, they're selfish. Everything's about them and how they feel. When I worked in psychiatry, I've got to tell you, I don't think I ever worked with anybody as an inpatient who had low self-esteem issues. What I was seeing were people with an overrated sense of self-importance. Literally, there was nothing important enough for them to get out of bed for. And I hate to say this, and I suspect I'll probably get some negative comments in the comment section, But I've met a lot of unemployed people, and they don't suffer low self-esteem. I'm talking about the chronically wealthy unemployed, as opposed to people who are in areas where people have been laid off. They won't get out of bed for less than such and such and such and such, and they deserve such and such. There's a sense of entitlement. It's beneath me to subject myself to this type of employment. I'm going to wait for something better, that kind of stuff. And that amazes me. Most of the highly successful people that I know, and I think I am pretty successful in my own way, I've never had that. I would do any job if I had to do a job in order to get an income coming in. I would rather do something than sit around thinking I'm self-important. Now, in the psychiatric units that I worked in, there was a massive overrated sense of self-importance. This wasn't a low self-esteem issue. This was an issue of too much self-importance. And every thought, every feeling, everything that went on inside their body, that was really important for us to hear about endlessly all day and sometimes all night, about the thoughts they had, the feelings they had, how badly they feel about certain things, whatever memory just popped into mind, or what dream they had last night. Let's tell everyone about the... Oh my goodness. Maybe actually no one cares. It's just a thought, it's one of those things. So self-esteem is one of those funny ones, because I have a little suspicion that a lot of people with low self-esteem actually have an overrated sense of self-importance, and it's not quite how it appears to be. Now, there's one little story I just want to share, which is my additional thing for this particular chapter, and it was a young woman who was referred to me. This is now quite a lot of years ago, over 10 years ago. She was referred to me by a social worker. The issue was she was young and depressed and suicidal, had been in group therapy and one-to-one therapy with the social worker, and was showing a progressive deterioration over time. And the social worker was getting quite concerned, and she said, "You're my last resort." Something I hear quite a bit. I'm not people's first choice. And essentially, the social worker had been trying to raise this girl's self-esteem, and the more work they were doing, the worse she seemed to get. And I suspected there may well be a relationship between the work that's going on and the deterioration of the mental state of this young woman. Young woman comes to see me. I worked from home at the time, and comes to what was actually the spare bedroom, obviously no bed in there, spare bedroom, and tiny little room full of stuff. It's just full of stuff. Girl comes in, she's not quite what she's used to with therapy. She's used to posh psychiatrist's office and psychologists doing the clinical assessments and hospital units, because she's a couple of suicide attempts. All sorts of things that were clinical and professional. And then there's me, didn't have so much hair at the time. And I said, "Okay, so what's the problem?" And she said, "Low self-esteem." And I've got to say, she sat there looking pretty poor. She was sort of goth type appearance. Very pale, not through makeup, looked very unhappy, very unwell, to be honest, and didn't look like she was doing too well at all. And I could see why the social worker was sufficiently concerned. So I said, "Okay, what's the problem?" She says, "Low self-esteem." Now, to which I said, "How do you know?" She comes back with, "I hate myself. I hate myself." Now, this is what I did. I wrote that down. I had a flip chart. I thought for a moment I had a flip chart here. I don't. I had a flip chart, so I flicked that. Low self-esteem. I hate myself. I hate myself. I hate myself. I hate myself. Just seemed like this may not be a low self-esteem issue. Now, I said to her, "Okay, so what do you want? What do you want from me?" To which she went, been conditioned then to say self-esteem, because she's been in a lot of therapy trying to raise her self-esteem. It just seemed to me this wasn't a self-esteem issue. This was an issue about hate. I hate myself. Now, maybe self deserves to be hated, or maybe it doesn't. Now, bolstering self and reassuring self that there's nothing there to be hateful. Self is fine. You're absolutely fine. You're fine. Doesn't stop I from having hate, because self is not I. I hate myself. I hates, self is hated. I hate, self is hated. Trying to convince self not to feel hated basically means I get to hate without consequence to self. Try and keep up. You may need to play that one through in your head a few times. If I hate myself and we increase self-esteem, I continue to hate without consequence upon myself. I charted that out for her on the board, and she was like, oh, wow, whatever. And to which I said, this is not a self-esteem issue. This is an issue about hate. You are a hateful person. She was full of hate. She didn't like her therapist very much. She very clearly didn't like me very much either. That became quite apparent quite quickly. But she couldn't deny the fact that this was an issue of hate. Now, it got me wondering how many people are in therapy for what is a hate issue, not a self-esteem issue. If you hate yourself, if you don't like yourself, that kind of stuff, then you have to actually look at the active component of that dynamic, not just the passive component of not being liked, of being hated. You got to look at the active part that I play with this, the I that speaks. And within this, you may want to consider some of the ways that you might talk to yourself. You might give yourself some hard times. You might call yourself names, you might say all sorts of horrible things to yourself. But would you actually say that to somebody else? Well, maybe you would. But would you say it to someone else who didn't deserve it? Or would you just... Is it a good thing to say? Is it a good way to encourage a person to change by giving them a hard time about stuff? I'm not convinced it is. I think there's probably better ways. Now think about this. How we talk to ourselves. Go on, Andy, you can do this. Is a very different proposition to saying, I can do this. You're such an idiot. You are such an idiot. Why do you... Compare that to, I'm such an idiot. Why do I do this? You hear the difference between the two. So sometimes we have a different point of position. And this is where you can start to really evaluate your internal dialogue and what perceptual position you take up with that. And for those that are unfamiliar with the NLP, aligning perceptual positions, have a look at Tamara and Connie Ray Andreas' work in aligning perceptual positions, because this will help you start to understand the different point of references you have for your internal dialogue and the position you take to yourself. Some people are not aligned with being on their selves side. They seem to be very much antagonistic against themselves. That's a very odd thing to do. I'm against myself. How about being for yourself, and I can show myself how to behave differently, but maybe I don't know how. In which case now I have to find out so self can behave differently. I have to take the lead here, rather than go to a therapist to have myself fixed so I get to stay the same. This is the dynamic that goes on. It gets very confusing, complicated, but you have to track the pronouns. Now, I don't know if any of that makes any sense whatsoever. It's a theme, actually, that then crept into the integral eye movement therapy, IEMT, and the identity work we do there, which is built around this I, me, self, and you concept. So, self-esteem issue. Is it a self-esteem issue, or is it an issue of self-hate, or hate of self? Do use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I'm always interested in any other examples that people have of this kind of phenomena.